Hi, and welcome to my FlossTube channel. I'm Jean Farish, and I am so glad that you're here with me today. I have a lot to share with you. I'm going to start with some of the updates on my works in progress, and then I'm going to get right into the main event this week, which is talking about the overdyed flosses that we love to stitch with, and are they color fast? And if not, how to make them color fast. So let's start with an update on the Roxie Mystery Stitch Along. I don't get to share my progress on this with you very often because, frankly, once I get a part done, then it's time to send it out to the subscribers, and I like for them to see it first. So once I send it out to them, then there's a small window of time that the project's kind of static, and then I start working on the next part. So that's kind of where I am right now. So part 4 that just got released included this strawberry, which is stitched in an overlapping cross stitch. And then I added the script alphabet and a divider border that's another variation of the herringbone. So we've actually done 3 herringbones so far. We did a 2-trip herringbone here, a very traditional herringbone here, and then stitching it in the same color and the same number of strands and everything. This one, the herringbone stitch, is kind of tall and skinny, and then this one, it's shorter and wide. So the stitch is executed in the same way, it's just that the count is different between the two of them. I did make some changes in the script alphabet from the original Roxana Corson. The G in Roxana's work just didn't look like a G to me. And then I also changed the letters S and T. And I think that they're the main things. There may have been a few little tweaks along the way, but for the most part, I tried to stay true to Roxana Corson's original work and only made changes when I really thought that it would be beneficial in the long run. One change I did make, or major change that I made, is that in the Algerian eyelet alphabet, I only include the letters from A to R in this little space filler thing here. It's really not unusual in antique samplers to have a partial alphabet. The Janet Irving sampler that I also reproduced only goes from A to N. But for Roxie, the main reason that I reduced the alphabet lines from the complete alphabet to just A through R was a matter of the space that I had available. Early on in the planning stages, I decided that when I was done that this would fit a standard frame so that people who did not want to spend the money on custom framing could still get a nice frame and do a good job of finishing their work when they were all done with the stitching. And so I had some tough decisions to make. In the original Roxana Corson, the verse is done, is stitched over 1. So of course it takes up much, much less space than the same quote stitched over 2. And when you think about it, it's not just twice as big, it's 4 times as big. So so that was one thing. In order to include the original verse, it was going to take up more space. And then, like I say, I wanted to make sure that when all was said and done, that it would fit a standard frame. And so that was the constraints that I imposed upon myself in creating Roxie, a reimagined sampler from the antique. My next work in progress doesn't look like much of a work in progress because it looks like it's completely stitched, and it is. But this is one that the work is the behind the scenes work. I am making video tutorials to go with each of the white work stitches that are in this piece, the pulled thread stitches, and I am getting it ready to make it available to everyone. Right now, it is only an in-person workshop project. And by making the video tutorials to go with it, then I will be able to share it with a wider audience. So in doing that, what I have to do is restitch the whole thing so that I can do the stitching on camera. So it's really a big project. And, you know, I've always had respect, I think, for people in many different walks of life and many different career paths and whatnot. But I want to tell you, video production is a whole lot more complicated once you get involved in it and try to do as professional a job as you possibly can with the tools that you have and the training that you have. So hats off to people who actually do this professionally. It's, I mean, I've made every mistake from forgetting to start the camera and getting 20 minutes into a process and realizing I haven't saved anything, to losing, in fact, that's what happened last week. I lost a segment of the Roxie sampler. As I was putting the whole thing together, I realized that there was a critical part that I just didn't have, and trying to recreate it was a bit of a creative challenge. Anyway, so that's one of the things that's going on. This is Lady Elizabeth, and it's part of the English Summer Garden series. There's 4 in the series altogether. 2 of them are already out there, and so this will be the 3rd, and then I've got Lady Charlotte that will follow it. So that's one of the big projects I have going on. And kind of related to that, I got a really good question from Marilyn about the pull thread stitches that I showed you last week. She said, could I use the pulled thread method on 20 count Lugana? And I can answer that with a little bit broader application than just 20 count Lugana. So it's because it doesn't have to do with the thread count. It has to do with the way the fabric is woven. So take a look at this. And I just did it again. I didn't start my camera. Okay, starting from the top here. So this is a piece of linen that's very typical of what I use for my pulled thread work. And you can see that it's pretty open. Compare it to this fabric, which frankly is either Lugana or Joplin. I don't remember which one it is, and I don't have it labeled. It's just something in my stash. And you can see how more closely woven the fabric is. In other words, the ratio of linen threads to space is more equal here. On this one, the space is much less than the width of the fabric threads. I hope that makes sense. How that gets applied to pull thread work is that when the linen threads are already woven close together, there's no space for you to pull them together to create the lacy look that you get for something like the stitches in this segment of Lady Elizabeth. So you need a fabric that has gaps between the linen threads. So the bottom line is, yes, you can execute the stitches on a tightly woven linen, or even weave, like Lugana or Joplin, but you're not going to get the same effect of the exact same stitch on a more loosely woven or more open woven linen. And after I shared my new love of stitching from my iPad, Anna posted a comment about using Adobe Acrobat Reader. She said, and I quote, "It's really easy to use when it comes to marking off sections of a pattern. It's free as well." And Anna makes a great point here. In fact, I've been using Adobe Acrobat Reader for so many years, I forgot that I had it downloaded on my iPad and on my MacBook. So I use it so routinely, I didn't even think about it being a step in the process of how I was actually reading the charts on my iPad. It is free, and it's a very well respected program. It's not something that I would ever worry about downloading onto a device. So if you are still trying to figure out how to read charts on your iPad, download Acrobat, oh, I can't talk today. Adobe Acrobat Reader. And I think that you'll find that the rest of it's pretty easy. My segment about the washability of linens prompted quite a few comments that followed a similar theme, which is that very often it's not that the linen isn't washable, it's that the process used as an aftermarket thing, whether it's overdyed or printed or whatever, that process is what makes it not washable. And I really do appreciate that distinction, and I think that it's an important one. And it may seem like I'm making a lot to do about next to nothing, but I think because education is important to me, I think that it's important to make the distinction between, is it the fabric that isn't washable, or is it the aftermarket process that is not washable? And I really do wish that people would understand the difference, because when it's sort of like that old game of Whisper Down the Lane, or if anybody's as old as I am watching this, we used to play a game called Telephone that you would, again, works just like Whisper Down the Lane. One person would whisper something to the next person, and then they would whisper it to the next person. It was a party game. And when it got to the end, what that last person heard and what the first person said are often very, very different. And so when people hear, you can't wash that linen, what they're hearing is, linen's not washable. They're not hearing this particular piece of linen, because of the way it's been processed, the process has made it not washable. I don't know. I hope you get that. And again, my apology if I'm making a big deal out of nothing, but I just feel pretty strongly about it. And in fact, I feel pretty strongly about the next thing I want to talk about, which are the over-dyed flosses. And I'm just going to come right out here and say it. If the thread that I'm stitching with is not washable, I'm not going to stitch with it. It's just that simple. I am a strong proponent of washing and ironing all of my traditional cross-stitch pieces once I'm finished them. Now, a lot of that comes from the fact that I stitch in hand. If I was stitching on a frame of some sort, and many people take all kinds of precautions with their stitching that I don't take. Again, nothing wrong with them. Hats off to them that they do this. Whether it's always, not only washing your hands before you sit down and stitch, but getting up every hour and washing your hands again. Many people put a cloth or something over their work with maybe a circle cut out so that only the part that they're stitching is exposed as they're stitching it. And it just isn't my style of stitching. So having a piece that's washable is at the top of my list. There are plenty of wonderful threads out there that are washable. They're the ones I'm going to use. So I launched into a experiment to see what I could find out about 3 major brands. And here they are. I used Classic Colorworks, and I picked similar colors in all 3 of them. The Gentle Art and Weeks Dye Works. And as you see here, I actually chose a dark red and a dark blue. And in each one of those brands, I also picked kind of an antique white with the idea that I want to do something patriotic with these colors. And then I already have all 3 colors chosen, so I can list all 3 of them in my color code. So that's kind of the plan when I get all done with this. Once I had the floss that I wanted to test, then I had to think about how I was going to go about this. And frankly, it really called upon my middle school and high school science classes of learning, when we learned about the scientific process. And I tried to be as scientific about it as possible. Every once in a while, I caught myself doing something that I thought, that's not very scientific. But I tried to be fair and objective in my testing. I also tried to be consistent in terms of measuring and timing and, you know, anything that could be a factor, water temperature, etc. I tried to be as consistent as possible. And at some point in the process, I thought, man, I wish that when I was in 7th grade and had to do a science fair project, that I had been able to do something like this, because I really enjoyed it. What I found out, though, was that, like many science experiments, you don't know what the outcome is going to be until you do them. And when I was done, basically, I had a lack of a conclusion. That then led to a whole second set of experiments, for lack of a better word, which is why this video ended up being so delayed, because the second step took 9 hours of real time. So that's why it's now Sunday evening and I'm still doing an edit for something that I should have been able to share with you on Saturday morning like usual. Now, it wasn't just the scientific experiment. Along with everything else, I had some family things planned, and I hope in your life your family comes first as often as possible, and it's certainly something I try to do. So that added to the delay as well. So here we are. Before I get into the process that I used and the results, I want to talk a little bit about terminology. Basically, you have dye and you have a fiber, and you can dye that fiber successfully in a temporary way. But if you want the dye to last, or if you want it to be color fast, then you need a mordant. So think of it this way. The dye doesn't want to stick to the fiber, so it needs something to bond it. And think of the mordant as being like the glue that makes the dye stick to the fiber. That's how it's been explained to me, and it seems like a pretty realistic way of looking at the function of a mordant. The dye process is incredibly scientific, and in fact, the mordant actually changes the molecular bond between the fiber and the dye. So it is an essential part of this whole process. Also, the mordant that's used will depend on the fiber. And this is something that I learned in a wonderful class I took here locally in Winston-Salem. In fact, I ended up taking 3 different classes about dyeing, the dyeing process. And I frankly never thought about this, but fibers fall into 3 categories. They're either animal, plant, or man-made. So your animal fibers, the obvious one is wool, but also, and I didn't think about this before, silk is produced by an animal. And then of course your plant fibers, and the 2 that we are the most used to are cotton and linen, but then there's also bamboo, which has become very popular. And then you've got your whole group of man-made fibers. So some dyes work well with a protein-based fiber that does not work with a plant-based fiber. Same thing's true with mordants. So it's like you have to have the right combination of dye, mordant, and fiber. The other thing that's critical here is that some mordants are used before the dye bath. It's sort of like conditioning the thread to prepare it to accept the dye. Some mordants are used in the dye bath, and some are used as the last step in the process. But none of them are used after the dye process is completed. And that becomes important in one really significant way. And that is that people insist that they can stabilize a dye by using salt or vinegar, which are two common mordants, but they don't work after the dye process is finished. So I had learned that, eons ago in home ec or whatever. It was brought home to me again in that dye class that I took, and in the research that I did in preparation for this. I kept coming across that same statement over and over and over again by a wide range of experts. In fact, one said it the best, and they basically said, you're wasting your money to think that you can stabilize a dye after the fact with salt or vinegar. So also be aware that many common mordants, as far as mordants used by professionals, are actually poisonous. And so great care has to be taken when you are learning the dye process. You need to wear gloves, and many dye professionals are always going to also wear goggles. So keep that in mind. So what are some things that are mordants? Okay, copper, iron, tin, chrome, some of which are not used as often now because they're not as environmentally safe or can be a health hazard. But some of the more common household things are alum, which is the same stuff you use for canning and preserving. You can use pennies, old pennies that truly still are made with copper. I have used iron. I've used old nails as a mordant. As I said, table salt and vinegar can also be mordants during the dye process. Baking soda and even cream of tartar. All of these things are you may have read or heard that they can be used as mordants, and it's true. But go back to what I said before. Some of them work with animal threads. Some of them work with plant threads. Some of them work with man-made threads. Some of them are common to all of them. You just have to know which is which. One of the sources that I used was the Spruce.com, and much of what they were writing about was the proper care of fabrics and ready-made clothing. But what they had to say can also be applied to what the flosses that we use. So for example, this is one of the things that I read. If you suspect that brightly colored clothes are going to bleed, should you try to set the color? Some people add salt to a load of clothes to set the color, while some swear by the idea that adding distilled white vinegar to the wash or rinse water will set the dye. Unfortunately, neither method will work reliably to prevent dye bleeding from clothes or fabrics that have already been commercially dyed. Don't waste your time or resources. And then it went on to say, there is some science and history to the salt and vinegar stories. When cotton yarn or fabrics are dyed, salt is added to the dye bath as a mordant to help the fibers absorb the dye. For wool or nylon, the acid in vinegar acts as a mordant in the dye bath to help fibers absorb dye. But neither is a dye fixative for already dyed fabrics or fibers. So again, if you are a firm believer that your salt bath or vinegar bath is doing some good, then by all means continue doing it. And as you will hear, I actually used it in the first set of experiments simply because I wanted to see if it made any difference. The other term that deserves some time here is the term Colorfast. And interestingly enough, the term Colorfast is only about 100 years old. It was first coined in 1916 by manufacturers of textiles who were trying to create some standards for their industry. They were concerned with how color was affected by light, by the process of washing and drying, by human perspiration, and by abrasion. And I think we have all experienced some time or another that color can actually rub off of fabric. So there are now standards that rate fabric behavior when it's exposed to testing, and the scale is from 1 to 5. These standards are set by the American Association of Textile Chemists and Colorists, which is actually, even though it has the word American in there, the members of this group come from as many as 60 different countries. They are dye professionals, they are textile manufacturers, they are colleges and universities, they are testing facilities. These are the sort of entities that belong to this group. And so they have set 5 levels of color fastness, with 5 being the most color fast. So when someone says, yes, this is color fast, I have yet to see anything that says color fast on a standard level 5 or 4 or 3 or 2 or 1. So something that's color fast on level 1 is not anywhere near as color fast as something that's color fast on level 5. And again, one of the things I saw on Spruce.com was this: clothing manufacturers should tell you if the garment is going to bleed. After all, they're the ones that know how the fabric was dyed. Most don't tell you outright because who wants to buy something that bleeds? But there are hints. If the label says wash separately or wash with light colors, that usually means the dye isn't stable and is going to bleed or even rub off. One last thing before I get into the actual experiment, and that is about heat. Heat will set color, which makes you think, why don't I just iron my floss before I start stitching with it? Now that's one experiment I didn't do. Well, maybe that'll be for another day. So the reason this is important is if you do wash your embroidery and the color starts bleeding, don't use heat. Don't put it in a clothes dryer. Don't iron it. It's okay just to let it dry naturally, but keep it away from heat sources until you have clearly gotten the dye out. Don't panic. Most times, even if it bleeds after you have done your stitching, you can get most of it out if you don't panic and you take some time and some steps. But I will tell you this, every process to get rid of that dye after the fact is 10 times longer and more involved than if you just take some precautions. The first step in my experiment here is to create the solutions I'll need for each one of the floss samples. So the salt solution should be 1 part table salt to 16 parts of water. So I have 2 cups of water here and 1/8 of a cup of table salt. While that's dissolving, I'm going to mix up vinegar solution. The research that I did showed that a vinegar solution needed to be 1 part vinegar to 4 parts water. I already have 1/2 of a cup of vinegar in my measuring cup here, so I need to bring this up to 2.5 cups to have the right amount. In an effort to be a little bit scientific, by the way, all the water that I'm using is room temperature and has been purified with a Brita filter. And finally, for the Orvis soap, I decided to mix up 4 cups of water with 1/4 of a teaspoon of Orvis soap. which frankly is probably more soap than I normally use. The directions on the color catchers say that you can use 1 sheet in a load of laundry. So I kind of am just using my own logic here that 1/4 of a sheet would be a gracious plenty for our experiment here. So I've got 2 sheets here that I'm folding in the quarters to make a total of 8 sheets since okay, so I'm all set up here for the first round. And as you can see, I've labeled each of the bowls of water. And I'm using white bowls so that hopefully if there is any color bleed, we will see it immediately. And I have pre-cut my floss into 25-inch, 24, 25-inch lengths. I've also put a small snippet and attached it to the color card. So we're starting here with a Weeks Dye Works, and this is the garnet color. So let's see what happens here when I put a single strand in with the color catcher. And one in the plain water. And that's the Orvis soap. The salt water. And the vinegar. So I'm just going to make sure that everything's completely submerged in each one of the bowls. Just going to leave that there for about 15 minutes. We'll start with a plain water here. So taking out the strand, and I'm going to put it on a paper towel. Just press it together. And I don't see any color transfer at all. No bleeding, nothing. So since I didn't have any with plain water, I certainly don't expect any with any of the other colors. And when you look down in the bowls, you can see that they are pretty much clear. But I'll start with a fresh paper towel with each one of them. So this is with the color catcher. Just gonna run it through the crease in the paper towel, and again, I don't see any color transfer. So this first skein was, again, the Weeks Dye Works and the color Garnet. Now we're going to take a look at what happens with sampler threads. Now, although on this side it says that it's Colorfast, on the reverse side the directions are very clear in their suggestion that you first wash it in hot water. Now I'm not going to do that right now because I want to treat each one of these skeins the same. So again, I'm just using room temperature water here to start with. At this point, I continued to follow the same steps for the Gentle Art sampler threads, and then did the same steps for the classic color works. And in the end, my conclusion was that all that work didn't really give me the information I needed. So when I finished making those little video clips and with the plan to put them all together, I thought I was pretty much done. And then I thought, well, you know what? I only let each thing soak for like 5 minutes. What if I let it soak for a couple of hours? What would happen? Let me share this with you. So this second sort of accidental phase, I put about a half a cup of hot water back in those little white bowls that I had used, and with a piece of the color catcher. And again, I took a full sheet and cut it into 4 parts because, you know, if the whole sheet is used for a whole load of laundry, then surely this little half a cup of water doesn't need the whole sheet. And I was trying to be frugal. So this is what it looked like after 3 hours. And I was surprised that it has this green tinge rather than turning red. So I then put it in for another 3 hours. And I don't know if it's going to show up here, but it's pretty pale, but still had a little bit of color in it. 3 more hours and the color catcher was white. So that was with the classic Colorworks. And by the way, I also just used a piece of white pearl cotton to tie the strands together before I soaked them so that they wouldn't get tangled up or whatever. So this is the week's dye works. Here's the first one after 3 hours, and I frankly could barely see any color on this one. So I just did this one for a second set of 3 hours. There was really no reason to do this one for the whole 9 hours. So you can see that this one, and this is the one that does say that it is, see, I'm pretty sure it says on here. Yeah, it says Colorfast based on industry standards. But again, we don't know whether it's a 5, 4, 3, 2, or 1. So that's the week's dye works. And then the sampler threads, you can see that has a little bit of a pinkish tinge after the first 3 hours, and after the second 3 hours, I didn't see any color on there at all. So, like, I do remember this from my, 7th grade science classes. In the end, you have to have a conclusion. So here's my conclusion. All that time I spent on my first set of experiments was kind of a waste. And that happens with science. The second thing was far more productive. So here's what I myself will do going forward. First of all, if I can find the colors that I want, I know which brand I'm going to go with. And that's Weeks Dye Works. And that's mainly because they had the least amount of color loss. But with that said, I also only tested 1 color each from the 3 brands. So I would take what I just said with a grain of salt. But once you decide which brand you want to work with, please, 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 please pre-wash it and keep rinsing it until you don't have any color loss. I have become a believer in color catchers because it gives you a very clear indicator that the color has been pulled out of the skein. So if it's a skein that the threads are pre-cut, then take I just used like 3 or 4 lengths, you know, maybe 4 or 5, just long enough to be easy to tie, and tied up, kind of loosely tied it up in bundles. If it's a floss that's not cut and you don't want to cut it because you use floss bobbins, then while you still have it, you know, in its circle, then you can still tie it in 3 or 4 places and to keep it from getting tangled up. I would then use hot water, because you might as well use hot water at this point. I don't use hot water when I wash and iron my project when I'm finished. I want to be very clear about that. But for this step, I would use the hot tap water, put it in a small basin, and again, just leave it for 3 hours, and keep doing that until I ended up with a clear color catcher. Now, I can hear your wheels turning right now saying, oh, I don't want to do all that for a project that's got 20 colors. Well, I plan to do that because I'm not going to take the chance with my project when I'm done. And as I said, I am a strong proponent of washing and ironing all of my needlework, my traditional cross-stitch needlework, when I'm finished. Again, you know, so I don't get mail about this, I will tell you, if it's gold work, for example, no, I don't wash and iron that. So I'm talking about your traditional cross-stitch projects. And, you know, let me just also say this. Even if you don't intend to wash and iron it when you're finished, and you're saying to yourself, I will never wash and iron my projects when I'm done, you know, life happens, and sometimes things get wet that we don't intend to get wet, or something gets spilled on your work or whatever, and you need to rinse it out. Well, then it's going to get wet. Or people who use a steam iron, you know, they say, well, I don't wash my work, but I do iron it. And they use a steam iron, or they spritz it with water before they iron it. Well, you're still getting it wet. And if it's going to be a color that bleeds, it's going to bleed when you use steam, just like it will when you wash it. So for me, for the time I spend with my needlework, and even looking at the monetary part of it, yes, I'm going to take the time to pre-wash it. And if I have 10 colors in a project, then I'm going to take that color catcher and cut it up into, you know, take the sheet and cut it into the 4 pieces, and just use one each in each little bowl. You know, it wasn't that hard. It was time consuming, yes, but man, I just can't imagine the heartache of finishing a project and washing it and seeing color bleed. So anyway, so that's my conclusion. And as I said earlier, you know, now I have those dark blue skeins, so maybe I'll try ironing them first and seeing if I can heat set it and see what happens. So, you know, there's a little bit of science in my future here, in between my stitching projects, my designing projects. So yeah, that's one more profession. I said, you know, at the top of this, I have a lot of respect for people who make their living in video production, and I have a lot of respect for scientists. When I found myself in that first part of my experiment, when I would like put the floss in the different bowls and kind of swish them around with my finger, and then I would go right to the next bowl, and I'm thinking, wait a minute, so whatever I was swishing around in this bowl is now on my finger, and now I'm going to swish it around in this bowl, so I've now contaminated the second bowl with whatever, you know, so that's not scientific. So I confess that I thought about it, but I didn't change my procedure either. So again, those of you who are out there, you know, teaching science to kids, or who work in any sort of a laboratory situation, I have a lot of respect for what y'all do. Anyway, so now with all that said and done, I'm going to go and sit and stitch for a while. And I hope that wherever you are, that you are stitching happy and stay safe. I'll see you next week.